Welcome to Anatomy Coloring Book, page 28. This is Dr. Stephen Harkins. Bony thorax. This refers to the rib cage, the skeleton of the chest. It contains inside of it the heart, lungs, other organs, vessels, and nerves. The anterior portion of the bony thorax is the sternum. Sternum is this area here, also known as your chest bone or breastbone. And it is divided into parts. The first part is called the manubrium. Manubrium is this upper part right here. And the manubrium is attached to the next part of the sternum proper, the body of the sternum here. And lastly, the xiphoid process. Between the manubrium and the body of the sternum is this little area, a very subtle little line there called the sternomanubrial joint that only flexes very slightly during respiration, during breathing, and expanding the lungs when you breathe in. The xiphoid also makes a little fibrocartilaginous joint below on the bottom end of the sternum. The sternum is spongy or cancellous bone we talked about in bone formation, and it does contain red blood marrow, or just red marrow. Attached to the manubrium and the body of the sternum are what's called costal cartilage. Costal means rib, so it's rib cartilage. And in fact, these areas right here do make up a part of the rib, but it's a cartilage portion of the rib. This is not hard bone right here. This is rib cartilage called costal cartilage. And you can see as we go down farther here what begins to happen right about right here. Notice how the costal cartilage is shared. There's not one direct costal cartilage per one rib. This is the rib here. These are the ribs, bony ribs. And notice how they connect directly to, here's rib number 1, the manubrium, rib number 2, the manubrium and sternum, rib number 3, a direct connection, rib number 4, direct connection, rib number 5, direct connection. But watch what happens at rib number 6. It comes around and it has a shared cartilage connection with rib number 7, 8, 9, and 10. But these ribs up here that have direct connections are called true ribs, while the ribs lower that share this cartilage are called false ribs, because they don't share a direct connection. They don't have a direct connection. They have to share this cartilage with one another to make a connection to the bottom of the sternum right here. And notice these ribs sort of, here's an example of how the ribs share the cartilage right here. Ribs 6 through 10. And so let's take a closer look at the cartilage and their connections with the sternum and the manubrium. But first, let's talk about another type of rib in the back. Ribs 11 and 12, they are called floating ribs because they have no connection with the sternum. They end right here. It's as if they are floating. They do not come around and make a connection with the sternum, nor do they have a cartilage connection. So you've got your true ribs, your first 5. Ribs 6 through 10 are 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 are called false ribs, or they're called, false ribs. And then 11 and 12 are called floating ribs. The cartilage connects with the ribs here at a little joint called the costochondral joint. Costochondral. Costo meaning rib over here, and chondral meaning cartilage. So it's the bone of the rib and the cartilage meeting together in a costochondral joint. Now, the area here where the cartilage meets the sternum is called a sternocostal joint because it's where the cartilage meets the sternum. It's where the cartilage, the sternum meets the cartilage. So this is called a sternocostal joint. Not to be confused with the costochondral joints. Now, obviously, every rib has a costochondral joint. Here, 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 here. Well, except 1 through 10, not the floating ribs. But not every rib has a sternocostal joint. And as a matter of fact, this here is called the sternomanubrial joint here because it's where the sternum, or it's where the excuse me, that's not the sternomanubrial joint. It is a sternocostal joint with the manubrium. And of course, the sternomanubrial joint is right in here. So we have the manubrium of the sternum, body of the sternum, and the xiphoid process. And looking at the spine, or the thorax, the bony thorax from the posterior now, we can see how the ribs originate and where they come from the posterior. Notice how they attach here. Here's rib number 1. First of all, these are what are called thoracic vertebrae. These are the vertebrae of your middle back. These right here. This is thoracic vertebra number 1. There are 12 thoracic vertebrae. This is number 2 here, number 3, number 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12. And attached to the ribs, each thoracic vertebra has a rib. And you can see the rib projecting out here, and there's a joint that is, this is the neck of the rib, and the head of the rib is sort of tucked under the vertebra here, and it forms a joint right in here. So this is rib number 1, rib number 2, rib number 3, and rib number 4. So each rib is attached to its corresponding thoracic vertebra. So thoracic vertebra number 1 is associated with rib number 1. 2, 3, thoracic 3, T3 it's called. T4. So you would call this the T4 vertebra, the T, the thoracic vertebra, and you would call this the T4 rib affiliated with that vertebra. All the way down to T12, you can see here the T12 floating ribs coming off of the T12 vertebra. So we have discussed the 7 true ribs. 1, 2, 3, 5, 6, 7, which I suppose can be called true ribs down to 7, 6, and 7, because they have somewhat of a direct attachment, and it is the 5 false ribs below that, number 12, 11, 10, 9, and 8, because 12, 11, 10, 9, 8, because they are in fact the ones that are joined here by the cartilage. So these are your false ribs. They're all considered, these bottom 5 are all considered false ribs. And 11 and 12, the last 2 are considered floating. So I stand corrected. And we have also discussed the costal cartilage, the rib cartilage. There's an opening formed here by the ribs. It is called the superior thoracic aperture. And that is where it's the opening and is a connection from the neck to the bony thorax. And through it travels the esophagus. Your food travels down there, through there. And certain blood vessels to and from the heart. The trachea from which you breathe. All kinds of nerves and ducts and vessels come in and out of the superior thoracic aperture. Now down here, what we find is a close-up of what's happening here in the rib joints. How does the rib connect to the thoracic vertebra? Well, here are the thoracic vertebrae. Here's T5, T6, T7. And notice the processes that come off of the vertebra. Notice the funny shape of the thoracic vertebra with a little wing on it. That's called a transverse process. This is a spinous process, and this is the transverse process. These bumps here are the bumps that you can feel on a person's back, but the same bone has wings that spread out to the right and left side. And that's what these are right here, the transverse process. Well, the rib, each rib connects in 2 different places. It has 2 different joints in the way it connects to the vertebra. So each rib, if you'll notice here, attaches to the vertebrae at actually 3 different places. These 2 little facets from the rib, a facet is a joint surface, a smooth joint surface. Here and here are the rib facets, and then we have a tubercle or a bump right here. So obviously this is the rib, and it has this curved shape to it. Here is the end right here, the chondral end, that connects to the cartilage on the front, on the anterior. But this is what's happening in the back. These two little transverse little rib facets fit in these two spots right here. While this tubercle here fits and matches in this little spot here. This is called the transverse facet because it is located on the transverse process. Remember, the transverse process is a little wing of the thoracic vertebra. These two little facets here together, one from the rib above, from the vertebra above, from T6, one from T7. Let's take another look at that. These are called Demi facets. They're little kind of half facets. Half here from T6 and half here from T7. So you can see how these two facets here are match up with the little Demi facets on the vertebra, and here it is shown with this rib right here. You can see how this rib comes in and articulates, and this is underneath, happening underneath. This is the tubercle of the rib articulating with the transverse facet of the transverse process on the other side of it. And now you can see underneath here, you can see the rib facets articulating with the Demi facets of the vertebra below. And here you see the tubercle articulating with the transverse process facet, the transverse facet. You get your transverse facets, you have your Demi facets, and you have your rib facets. You might call them facets, I suppose. And this setup here with these joints, these costo-transverse joints and costovertebral joints, they occur at all 12 vertebrae up and down the spine. Of course, they come out from here, from the Demi facets of the thoracic vertebra to the transverse facets and wrap completely around to the front of the body, the anterior, and articulate at the costochondral joints, the costochondral joints here, and then the cartilage takes over from there, and then we have a sternochondral joint. These are all synovial joints, by the way. In other words, they have capsules and fluid in them to keep the area very slippery and free from friction, so they are freely movable joints. And in fact, when you inspire, you inhale, up the rib cage elevates, and when you exhale, the rib cage depresses. And in fact, these ribs move in what's called a bucket handle movement. If you imagine each of these ribs as a bucket handle, and you lift the bucket handle up, or the bucket handle can drop down. So they move very slightly, but they do move in this bucket handle movement. Ribs are also an attachment point on the back for a lot of muscles, the back muscles that run up and down the spine. They attach on the ribs and on these thoracic vertebrae as well. And this represents the end of page 28, the bony thorax anatomy coloring book. This is Dr. Stephen Harkins. Until next time.